Red and blue lights piercing a pitch-black highway usually signal a routine traffic stop. But on this freezing North Carolina night, a corrupt, power-hungry cop pulled over the wrong car. Behind the wheel sat a highly decorated, active-duty Army lieutenant colonel. When that local officer let his vile prejudice pull the trigger, he thought he was just adding another buried statistic to his dirty precinct. He had no idea he had just declared an all-out war on the United States Pentagon. What followed was an explosive federal crackdown, a shattered cover-up, and a brutal dose of hard karma that sent a racist cop straight to the lethal injection chamber. Buckle up, because this real-life nightmare proves that ultimate justice is inescapable. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the windshield of the sleek, black SUV as it cut through the darkness of Oak Haven County, North Carolina. Behind the wheel sat Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling. At 42 years old, David was a man carved from discipline and duty. A West Point graduate, a veteran of 3 combat tours, and the recipient of the Silver Star, he had spent his entire adult life serving his country. Tonight he was exhausted. He was driving back from a high-level defense strategy dinner in Washington, D.C., heading south toward Fort Liberty. He was still wearing his Army dress uniform, its medals heavy on his chest, though it was currently hidden beneath a dark, civilian trench coat he had thrown on to ward off the biting cold. David kept his speed exactly at the limit. He was only 30 miles away from the base, listening to the rhythmic swish of his windshield wipers, his mind entirely focused on getting home to his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young daughters. A few miles behind him, lurking in the shadows of an underpass, sat Officer Gregory Harland. Harland was a man defined by his resentments. He had washed out of the State Trooper Academy years ago, failed the psychological evaluation due to anger management and authority issues. He had spent the last decade stuck in the low-paying, dead-end Oak Haven County Police Department. Harland carried a massive chip on his shoulder and a deeply ingrained bigotry that he barely bothered to hide. He had a thick personnel file full of excessive force complaints, mostly from minority drivers passing through his jurisdiction. But Police Chief Robert Higgins, a man equally steeped in the good old boy network, always managed to bury them. Through the downpour, Harland spotted the black SUV. He pulled out, his headlights illuminating the out-of-state Washington, D.C. license plates. In Harland's mind, an expensive car with out-of-state plates, driven at midnight through his county, meant only one thing: an easy target. He didn't have a reason to pull the vehicle over. The SUV was perfectly in its lane, driving the speed limit. But Harland didn't need a legal reason. He only needed an excuse. He punched the accelerator, closing the distance, and flipped on his flashing red and blue lights. Inside the SUV, David let out a heavy sigh. He checked his speedometer, 65 in a 65 zone. He signaled carefully and pulled over onto the muddy shoulder of the highway, shifting the car into park. As a black man in America, David knew the drill all too well, despite the heavy silver oak leaves on his shoulders. He turned off the engine, turned on the interior dome light so the officer could see inside, rolled down his window, and placed both his large hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. In his rearview mirror, David watched the officer step out of the cruiser. Harland walked with an exaggerated, aggressive swagger, his hand already resting heavily on the butt of his holstered service weapon. The rain battered Harland's uniform as he approached the driver's side window, shining his heavy mag-light flashlight directly into David's eyes, blinding him. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Harland snapped, his voice dripping with immediate hostility. "And keep your hands where I can see 'em." "Good evening, officer," David replied, his voice calm, steady, and projecting the quiet authority of a man used to commanding hundreds of soldiers under enemy fire. "My hands are on the wheel. My wallet is in the left breast pocket of my coat. I am going to slowly reach into my coat to retrieve it for you." "Did I tell you to reach for anything?" Harland barked, leaning closer, the beam of the flashlight shaking slightly. The sight of the calm, well-spoken black man driving a car that Harland could never afford ignited a vicious, irrational anger in the officer's chest. "I said keep your hands on the wheel." "I am complying with your orders, officer," David said, perfectly composed. "But I cannot give you my license unless I reach for my wallet." "Don't get smart with me, boy," Harland sneered, the racial slur slipping out with practiced ease. "Step out of the vehicle, now." David's jaw tightened. He knew his rights, and he knew this was an illegal escalation. But he also knew that surviving the traffic stop was the only priority. The side of a dark highway was not the place to argue the law. "I am stepping out of the vehicle," David announced clearly. He moved slowly, deliberately, pushing the door open with his left hand while keeping his right hand visible. The cold rain instantly soaked David as he stepped onto the wet asphalt. He stood at his full height, 6'2" of solid muscle. The sudden imposition of his physical presence made Harland take a half step back, a flash of cowardly panic crossing the officer's face. Harland drew his weapon, a Glock 17, and leveled it at David's chest. "Turn around and put your hands on the roof of the car," Harland screamed, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and rage. "Officer, there is no need for your weapon. I am unarmed. I am an active-duty military officer," David said calmly. As he spoke, a sudden gust of wind caught the heavy flaps of his unbuttoned civilian trench coat, blowing them back. For a split second, the interior dome light and the flashlight beam illuminated the uniform underneath. The dark green fabric, the rows of brightly colored ribbons, the gleaming silver oak leaves, the airborne wings. But Harland didn't see a decorated soldier. Blinded by his own prejudice, hopped up on adrenaline and unwarranted aggression, Harland only saw a black man making a sudden movement as the coat whipped in the wind. David instinctively moved his hand to pull the coat closed against the freezing rain, his fingers brushing near his breast pocket where his wallet sat. "He's got a gun," Harland yelled, though there was absolutely nothing in David's hand. Bang, bang, bang. 3 deafening shots shattered the quiet rhythm of the rain. David staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. The force of the hollow point bullets tore through his chest and abdomen. He looked down, touching his hand to the sudden, blooming warmth on his uniform jacket, pulling his fingers away to see them slick with crimson blood. He looked back up at Harland, not with anger, but with a profound, tragic disbelief. "My daughters," David whispered, before his knees buckled. The lieutenant colonel collapsed onto the muddy shoulder of the road, his head striking the front tire of his SUV. Harland stood frozen for 3 long seconds, the smoking gun trembling in his grip. The only sound was the rain and the hissing of the hot engine. He stepped forward cautiously, keeping his gun aimed at the motionless body. He kicked David's right hand, expecting to dislodge a weapon. Nothing. Harland knelt down, ripping the trench coat open, frantically searching for the gun he was so certain he had seen. His frantic hands found the breast pocket. He pulled out the object. It wasn't a weapon. It was a dark brown leather wallet. It flipped open in Harland's shaking hands, revealing a United States Department of Defense identification card. Sterling, David A. Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army. The blood drained entirely from Harland's face. He looked at the medals shining in the mud. He looked at the gaping wounds in the officer's chest. David Sterling was not breathing. A cold, sickening realization washed over Harland. He hadn't just shot an unarmed man. He had murdered a high-ranking officer in the United States military. If the truth got out, His badge wouldn't save him. His chief wouldn't be able to protect him. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. Harland scrambled to his feet, panic completely taking over. He ran back to his police cruiser and popped the trunk. From the bottom of his duty bag, wrapped in an oily rag, he pulled out a rusted, unregistered .38 caliber revolver with the serial numbers filed off. A drop gun, kept specifically for a nightmare scenario just like this. He ran back to David's body, wiped the revolver on his own uniform sleeve to clear any prints, and carefully pressed David's lifeless fingers around the grip before letting it drop onto the asphalt inches from the colonel's hand. Breathing heavily, Harland unclipped the radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. Shots fired, shots fired. Suspect drew a weapon. Suspect is down. Send EMS and the chief to my location." He then reached down to his chest and pressed the button to turn off his body camera. But Harland, in his panicked, adrenaline-fueled state, made a fatal miscalculation. He forgot that the new body cameras issued by the department had a continuous passive recording feature. Even when off, they recorded the video, though not the audio, of the previous 2 minutes before being activated. The camera had captured everything. The empty hands, the coat blowing in the wind, the murder, and worst of all, it had captured him pulling the drop gun from his trunk. By 1:30 a.m., the scene was swarming with local Oakhaven police. Crime scene tape flapped in the wind. Chief Robert Higgins, a heavy-set man with a chewed cigar clamped between his teeth, stood under an umbrella, listening to Harland's fabricated story. "He was acting erratic, Chief," Harland lied, his voice steadier now that he was surrounded by his own people. "I asked him to step out. He reached into his coat and pulled that .38. I had no choice. It was him or me." Higgins looked down at the body, now covered by a yellow tarp. He glanced at the rusted revolver on the ground. He didn't ask why an Army lieutenant colonel, driving an $80,000 SUV, was carrying a rusted, unregistered Saturday night special. He didn't want to know. In Oakhaven, cops protected cops. "Clean shoot, Greg," Higgins grunted, patting Harland on the shoulder. "Don't sweat it. The brass will have your back. We'll process the scene, put you on paid administrative leave for a couple of weeks, and the union will handle the rest." The local coroner arrived, loaded David Sterling's body into the back of a van, and quietly drove him to the county morgue. The local PD filed their preliminary reports, locking the drop gun into evidence and officially classifying the incident as a justified use of lethal force against an armed assailant. They thought they had buried the problem. They had no idea they had just lit a fuse that led directly to the United States Pentagon. Monday morning, 0800 hours. Fort Liberty. General Arthur Pendleton, a decorated 4-star general and the commanding officer of the Joint Special Operations Command, sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. The room was filled with military brass, waiting for the weekly strategic briefing to begin. There was only one empty chair. "Where the hell is Colonel Sterling?" General Pendleton barked. "Sir, he hasn't reported in," an aide nervously replied. "He didn't show up for physical training this morning, and his wife called the base frantically an hour ago. She hasn't heard from him since he left D.C. on Saturday night." Pendleton's eyes narrowed. David Sterling was the most punctual, disciplined officer in his command. If Sterling was missing, something was catastrophically wrong. "Get CID on it right now," Pendleton ordered. "Track his phone, track his vehicle GPS. I want to know exactly where he is." It took the Army Criminal Investigation Division less than 45 minutes to ping Sterling's cell phone. The signal didn't come from a ditch or a hospital. It came from a metal locker inside the Oakhaven County Coroner's office. When General Pendleton received the call, the silence in his office was deafening. "Murdered?" he whispered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Shot by local police? And they're claiming he pulled a weapon?" "Yes, sir," the CID lead investigator replied over the phone. "The local PD claims it was a justified shooting." Pendleton had served with David Sterling in Afghanistan. He had watched Sterling run through active mortar fire to drag wounded men to safety. He knew, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that David Sterling would never pull an illegal weapon on a police officer. "Assemble a federal task force." Pendleton's voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm register. "Get the FBI director on the line. I am deploying a CID detachment to Oak Haven immediately. Those local cops think they can murder one of my best men and sweep it under the rug." The general stood up, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "I am going to tear their entire department down to the foundation." By Tuesday afternoon, the sleepy town of Oak Haven looked like a military occupation zone. 3 massive black-armored FBI command vehicles, flanked by military police escorts, rolled directly into the parking lot of the Oak Haven Police Department. Federal agents in windbreakers and heavily armed CID investigators swarmed the building. Chief Higgins came storming out of his office, his face red with indignation. "What the hell is the meaning of this? You have no jurisdiction here." A tall, sharp-eyed FBI special agent in charge, flanked by an Army CID captain, slapped a federal search warrant directly onto Higgins's chest. "Chief Higgins," the FBI agent said coldly, "we are taking federal jurisdiction over the homicide of Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling. We are seizing all evidence, all personnel files, all dash cam footage, and all body cam footage. Your department is now under federal investigation for murder, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." In the back break room, Officer Harland watched the federal agents raid the evidence lockers. The smug confidence he had carried for the last 48 hours vanished, replaced by an icy, suffocating dread. The walls were closing in, and the true nightmare was only just beginning. The sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room at the federal courthouse in Raleigh was a stark contrast to the muddy, blood-soaked highway of Oak Haven County. Officer Gregory Harland sat at a bolted-down metal table, his police union representative and a high-priced defense attorney, William Hayes, flanking him. Harland felt a nervous sweat pooling at the base of his neck, but he clung desperately to the lie that had kept him out of prison for the last 72 hours. He was a cop. The system was designed to protect him. He just had to stick to the script. Across the table sat FBI Special Agent in Charge Thomas Blake and Army CID Captain Sarah Miller. They hadn't said a word for 5 minutes. They just stared at Harland, letting the suffocating silence do the work. "My client has already provided a full, sworn statement to the Oak Haven Internal Affairs Division," Hayes said, breaking the silence with practiced irritation. He was in fear for his life. The suspect, Mr. Sterling, made a sudden, aggressive movement and produced a firearm. This is a tragic, but textbook, justified use of force. If you don't have federal charges to file, we are leaving. Agent Blake slowly opened a manila folder on the table. "Textbook," Blake repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. "That's an interesting word, Mr. Hayes. Tell me, Officer Harland, what is your understanding of the Axon Body 3 camera system issued to your department last month?" Harland swallowed hard. "It records video and audio when activated. I didn't have time to activate it until after the shooting started, because of the sudden threat." "Right," Captain Miller chimed in, her eyes locked onto Harland with a predator's focus. "You pressed the button at 12:14 a.m., exactly 10 seconds after you fired the fatal shots into a United States military officer. But here is the thing about the Axon Body 3, Harland. It has a feature called passive buffering. Even when it's off, it is constantly recording a 2-minute rolling loop of video. No audio, just video. When you double-tap the button to turn it on, it permanently saves the previous 2 minutes of footage to the encrypted cloud server. The color drained entirely from Harland's face. The room suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. "Your local IT guy didn't know how to access the encrypted cloud," Agent Blake said, sliding a sleek silver laptop to the center of the table and turning the screen to face Harland. "But the FBI Cyber Division does." Blake hit play. The screen flickered to life in high-definition color. There was no sound, which somehow made the imagery even more haunting. It showed Harland walking up to the SUV. It showed Lieutenant Colonel Sterling, perfectly calm, his hands clearly visible. It showed the wind catching the trench coat. It showed Harland drawing his weapon and firing. Harland watched himself murder a man in cold blood. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. But the video didn't stop there. Because Harland had delayed activating his camera to call in the shooting, the buffer captured what happened next. The camera, mounted on Harland's chest, bobbed as he ran back to his cruiser. It showed him opening the trunk. It showed his hands rummaging through a duty bag. It showed him pulling out the rusted .38 caliber revolver. It showed him walking back to David Sterling's lifeless body, wiping the gun on his sleeve and pressing it into the dead man's fingers. Attorney Hayes stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He slowly pulled his hands away from the table, physically distancing himself from his client. The union rep looked sick to his stomach. "That is premeditated murder," Captain Miller stated, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "That is the destruction of evidence. That is a violation of civil rights under the color of law resulting in death. And the Pentagon is going to ensure you never see the sky again." "Wait," Harland stammered, his tough guy facade completely shattering. Tears of sheer terror welled in his eyes. "Wait, I panicked. He scared me. I thought he had a gun, and when he didn't, I knew my career was over. I just made a mistake." "A mistake?" Agent Blake scoffed, pulling a second document from the folder. "Let's talk about the drop gun, Gregory. You filed off the serial numbers, but the ATF laboratory in Quantico used a process called magneto-optical sensor imaging to read the stamped metal underneath the scratches. We recovered the serial number." Blake leaned forward, invading Harland's space. "That .38 Smith & Wesson was confiscated in a drug raid in Oak Haven County in 2019. You were the arresting officer. You never logged that weapon into evidence, did you? You kept it. You held on to an illegal, stolen firearm for 5 years, specifically to plant on a victim just in case you ever got trigger-happy." The trap had snapped shut. There was no wiggle room, no blue wall of silence to hide behind, no local chief to sweep it under the rug. Harland was completely exposed, caught in a web of his own arrogance and prejudice. "Officer Gregory Harland," Blake said, standing up and unhooking the handcuffs from his belt, "you are under arrest for the federal crime of murder, deprivation of rights under color of law, and federal obstruction of justice. Stand up and put your hands behind your back." The arrest of Officer Gregory Harland was not designed to be a quiet, procedural affair. The United States Department of Justice, relentlessly prodded by an utterly furious Department of Defense, wanted to send a shockwave that would shatter the foundations of every corrupt precinct in the nation. Hard karma was coming, and it was wearing federal tactical gear. At 4 a.m., on a bitter, rain-swept Thursday, Harland was sound asleep in his suburban home, out on bail following the initial local administrative hearings. He still clung to a fragile, delusional hope that the police union would somehow salvage his life. He was abruptly awakened not by an alarm clock, but by the cataclysmic roar of his reinforced front door being utterly obliterated by a C4 breaching charge. Before the pulverized wood could even hit the floor, flashbang grenades detonated in his hallway. The deafening, concussive blasts blew out the living room windows and filled the house with blinding, strobing light and thick white smoke. FBI, hostage rescue team, get on the ground. Before Harland could even throw off his bedsheets, a half-dozen heavily armored federal operators swarmed into his bedroom. A heavy tactical boot planted firmly right between his shoulder blades, violently pinning him face down against the hardwood floorboards. Cold, unforgiving steel zip ties bit savagely into his wrists as his arms were wrenched behind his back. As the operators dragged him out of his house and onto his front lawn, the flashing red and blue lights of the armored transport vehicles illuminated the faces of his stunned neighbors. For a decade, Harland had thrived on inflicting sudden, violent terror on unsuspecting motorists in the dead of night. Now, pinned against the cold, wet hood of a federal Bearcat, he was choking on his own medicine. The apex predator of Oakhaven County had become the prey. Simultaneously, 20 miles away, a second FBI strike team kicked open the glass double doors of the Oakhaven Police Department. Chief Robert Higgins, who had been frantically shredding documents in his office, was slammed against his own mahogany desk. Handcuffs were snapped over his wrists, and he was perp-walked out the front doors directly into a blinding sea of local and national news cameras. He was indicted on the spot for federal conspiracy to obstruct justice, accessory to murder after the fact, and systemic falsification of official records. By sunrise, the entire Oakhaven Police Department had been placed under a strict federal consent decree, completely stripped of its law enforcement authority, its armory seized, and its duties permanently replaced by state troopers. The corrupt sanctuary Harland thought would protect him was utterly burned to the ground. The trial of the United States versus Gregory Harland commenced 6 months later in the fortress-like federal district court of the Middle District of North Carolina. The media circus surrounding the courthouse was unprecedented, requiring a heavy perimeter of heavily armed United States Marshals to keep the crowds at bay. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. In the front row of the gallery, serving as a silent, monolithic reminder of exactly who Harland had crossed, sat General Arthur Pendleton. Beside him sat Sarah Sterling, David's grieving widow, her posture radiating an unbreakable, quiet dignity. Behind them, filling 3 entire rows, sat 24 high-ranking Army officers in their full Class A dress uniforms. Their chests were heavy with combat medals, and they sat perfectly, chillingly still. Every single day of the proceedings, their eyes burned directly into the back of Harland's neck, a unified front of absolute, uncompromising military wrath. The prosecution was led by United States Attorney Richard Kavanaugh, a ruthless, methodical litigator who did not merely seek a standard murder conviction. Because Harland had acted under the authority of his badge to commit a civil rights violation resulting in death, Kavanaugh invoked 18 U.S.C. Section 242. He filed a formal notice of intent to seek the federal death penalty. Harland's trial was an absolute legal bloodbath. His defense team, exhausted public defenders, as the police union had completely drained his defense fund and subsequently abandoned him the exact moment the body cam footage leaked, tried desperately to salvage his life. They attempted to argue that Harland suffered from severe paranoia, a hypervigilance born from the daily, compounding PTSD of his time as a police officer. They tried to paint him as a frightened civil servant who simply misjudged a high-stress situation. U.S. Attorney Kavanaugh obliterated that defense in less than an hour. He dimmed the courtroom lights and played the silent, high-definition Axon bodycam footage on a massive screen for the jury. The room fell into a deathly, sickening silence. They watched the decorated military officer, calm and compliant, brutally gunned down for simply reaching for his military identification. They watched the cowardly scramble as Harland retrieved the rusted revolver from his trunk and pressed it into the dead man's bleeding fingers. But Kavanaugh was not finished. He was about to introduce a twist that would seal Harland's fate with a brutal dose of undeniable karma. Kavanaugh called a surprise witness to the stand, a young, sharply dressed black man named Terence Miller. Terence had spent 3 grueling years in state prison, stemming from a highly questionable 2019 narcotics raid. "Mr. Miller," Kavanaugh asked, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls as he paced in front of the jury box. "I want to take you back to the night of your arrest in 2019. Who was the arresting officer who breached your apartment?" "He was," Terence said, raising a trembling finger and pointing directly at Gregory Harland. "Officer Harland." "And during that arrest, Mr. Miller, did you possess a rusted, unregistered .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver?" "Yes, sir," Terence replied, his voice growing steadier. "I had it sitting right on my coffee table, but I never reached for it. Harland tackled me, zip-tied me, and then he picked up the revolver. He didn't put it in an evidence bag. He tucked it directly into his own waistband, right under his uniform shirt. When we got to the holding cell, I told him I was going to tell my public defender about the gun to prove I surrendered peacefully." Kavanaugh stopped pacing. "And what did Officer Harland say to you in response?" "He leaned into my ear and told me that the gun didn't exist," Terence testified, his eyes locked onto his former tormentor. "He said if I ever breathed a single word about that .38, he would personally make sure I was stabbed to death in county lockup." The jury literally gasped. Harland slouched violently in his chair, his face entirely drained of blood, physically shrinking as the absolute totality of his corruption was laid bare for the world to witness. This was the nail in the coffin. Kavanaugh had just masterfully transformed the narrative. Harland wasn't a scared, stressed cop who made a tragic, split-second mistake. He was a calculated racist predator who had been weaponizing his badge for years. He had purposely stolen and hidden an untraceable firearm, keeping it in his trunk for half a decade, actively waiting for the perfect moment to execute an innocent person and cover his tracks. He had simply picked the wrong victim on the wrong highway. Closing arguments took less than a single afternoon. The jury instructions were read, and the 12 men and women retired to deliberate. They returned in a mere 4 hours. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, resulting in the premeditated death of Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling, we find the defendant, Gregory Harland, guilty. General Pendleton slowly reached out, placing his heavy, steady hand over Sarah Sterling's trembling shoulder. Justice was incredibly cold, but it was absolute. The penalty phase of the trial concluded just 1 week later. The federal jury, citing the uniquely heinous nature of the crime, the premeditated hoarding and planting of stolen evidence, and the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal of the public trust, handed down the absolute heaviest sentence allowable under the law. Officer Gregory Harland was officially sentenced to death by lethal injection, permanently condemned to wait for the Reaper in the darkest corner of the federal penitentiary system. The Special Confinement Unit at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, is not merely a prison. It is a meticulously engineered sensory void designed to break the human psyche. It is a sterile, soundproof tomb of reinforced concrete and blast-proof steel, built exclusively to house the federal government's most condemned inmates. For 3 agonizing, mind-shattering years, this suffocating purgatory was the entire universe for inmate number 4, 8291-054. The world no longer knew him as Officer Gregory Harland, the swaggering, arrogant enforcer of Oakhaven County, who once used his badge as a license to terrorize the innocent. In this bleak facility, he was nothing more than a number waiting for a lethal injection. His cell measured exactly 8 feet by 10 feet. There were no traditional iron bars to peer through and barter with neighbors, only a solid, heavy steel door featuring a narrow, thick glass observation slot. Harland spent 23 hours of every single day locked inside this concrete box. The physical toll of the isolation was devastating. The once burly cop had withered into a hollow, trembling shell. His hair had thinned dramatically, turning a wispy, lifeless grey. His skin carried the sickly, translucent pallor of a man who had not felt the direct warmth of the sun in over 1,000 days. Every time he managed to close his eyes, sleep offered no sanctuary. Instead, his nightmares forced him to endlessly relive the blinding rain, the flapping of the trench coat, and the profound, tragic dignity on the face of Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling just before the gunfire. Yet, true to his cowardly nature, Harland still did not feel genuine remorse. He only felt a crippling, overwhelming wave of self-pity. In the federal judicial system, death penalty appeals are notoriously slow, often dragging on for decades as they become hopelessly lost in an endless labyrinth of procedural motions, stays, and bureaucratic red tape. But Harland's case was a glaring, brutal exception. He had not just murdered a civilian, he had assassinated a highly decorated, active duty senior officer of the United States Armed Forces. The Pentagon had absolutely no intention of letting his memory fade into the slow churn of the appellate courts. General Arthur Pendleton, utilizing the massive, unyielding weight of the Department of Defense, maintained relentless, suffocating pressure on the Department of Justice. The Attorney General's office, feeling the heat from top military brass and outraged federal lawmakers, fast-tracked every single one of Harland's appeals. The appellate courts swatted down the desperate legal maneuvers of Harland's exhausted, court-appointed lawyers with ruthless, surgical precision. His claims of PTSD, of an unfair trial, of biased jury selection, all were immediately dismantled and discarded. When the final petition was submitted to the United States Supreme Court, the justices refused to hear it, denying the writ of certiorari without a single word of comment. The ultimate, terrifying finality crashed down on Harland's head. His execution date was set in stone, November 12th. With only 14 days left to live, a primal, suffocating panic completely consumed him. Harland decided to play his absolute last, desperate card. In his warped mind, he was still a cop who understood the dirty mechanics of the justice system. He knew how deals were made in the shadows. He demanded an emergency meeting with federal prosecutors, claiming he possessed explosive, systemic information that could bring down dozens of corrupt officials across the state of North Carolina. He drafted frantic, handwritten letters offering to be the star witness in a massive federal racketeering and corruption case. He promised to detail decades of planted evidence, racial profiling quotas, missing narcotics, and deliberately buried excessive force complaints. His asking price for this treasure trove of municipal rot? A commutation of his death sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He waited in the fluorescent-lit interview room of the Terre Haute facility, his wrists and ankles securely shackled to a heavy iron ring bolted to the floor. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat with every echoing footstep in the hallway outside. The heavy metal door finally clanked open. Harland expected a team of eager, ambitious federal prosecutors armed with legal pads and immunity agreements. Instead, only one man walked into the room, It was FBI Special Agent in Charge Thomas Blake, looking just as cold, sharp, and immaculately dressed as the day he had orchestrated the raid on Harland's home 3 years prior. "Agent Blake," Harland stammered, his heavy chains rattling loudly against the steel floor as he leaned forward with a sickening, eager desperation. "Thank God they sent you. Listen to me. I can give you everything. I have the names. I know exactly where the precinct slush funds are hidden. I know which local judges Higgins was actively bribing to sign blank, no-knock search warrants. I can give you the whole damn county on a silver platter. Please, just get the lethal injection off the table. Let me live." Blake slowly pulled a metal chair out and sat down across the table. He didn't open a briefcase. He didn't pull out a pen. He didn't even turn on a recorder. He simply looked at the broken man in the orange jumpsuit with a gaze of profound, chilling disgust. "We don't need your help, Gregory," Blake said quietly, his voice cutting through the sterile room like a razor blade. Harland's desperate, pleading smile froze instantly. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. "What do you mean you don't need it? I have the inside track. I was there for 10 years. You want to clean up Oakhaven? You absolutely need me." "You were a pawn," Blake corrected him, his tone entirely devoid of any sympathy. "You were a bottom feeder in a pond full of much larger predators. Did you really think you were the only one looking out for yourself? Did you actually believe the thin blue line applied to a cop who brought the wrath of the entire United States Pentagon down upon his department?" Blake leaned forward, planting his elbows on the metal table, ensuring Harland heard every single agonizing syllable. "Chief Robert Higgins took a federal plea deal 2.5 years ago, Gregory. The very second the FBI laid out the indictment, he rolled over on everyone. He gave us the corrupt judges, he gave us the slush funds, and he gave us the personnel files of every dirty cop in Oakhaven in exchange for a cushy, minimum security federal camp in West Virginia. The Oakhaven Police Department doesn't even exist anymore. We disbanded it entirely under a federal consent decree. The state troopers and county sheriffs patrol those highways now. The good old boy network you're trying to sell me was utterly eradicated while you were rotting in this cell." Harland slumped back in his chair as if he had been physically shot. The air rushed out of his lungs in a wheezing gasp. His grand plan, his final shield, dissolved into absolute nothingness. "You have absolutely nothing left to trade, Harland," Blake continued, standing up and straightening his tie. "Your former brothers in blue threw you to the wolves the exact second they realized they were in the crosshairs. Nobody is coming to save you. Nobody out there is protesting for you. Nobody cares about you. I didn't fly all the way to Indiana to negotiate." Blake walked over to the heavy steel door, pausing with his hand hovering over the buzzer. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Harland's terrified, weeping face. "I just flew out here to look you in the eye and watch your last shred of hope die," Blake said coldly. "You are going to walk into that chamber in 14 days, and the world is going to be a significantly better place the second your heart stops. Have a good evening, inmate." Blake pressed the buzzer. The door opened, and he stepped out into the hallway, leaving the heavy steel door to slam shut behind him with a deafening, final echo. As the metallic click of the deadbolt locked into place, leaving Harland entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the interview room, the true, inescapable horror of his reality finally set in. Hard karma had not merely come for his freedom, it had systematically, ruthlessly stripped away every lie, every shield, and every corrupt alliance he had ever known, leaving him to face the executioner completely and utterly alone. The Special Confinement Unit at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, is a structure engineered to extinguish hope long before it extinguishes life. It is a sterile, brutalist fortress of reinforced concrete, thick glass, and heavy steel, designed exclusively to house the federal government's condemned. For 3 agonizing years, this soundproof tomb had been the entire universe for inmate number 48291-054. Gregory Harland, the former Oakhaven County police officer, who once wore his badge like a crown of absolute authority, had been reduced to a trembling, hollowed-out ghost. November 12th arrived devoid of sunlight, shrouded in a dense, freezing Midwestern fog that clung to the razor wire surrounding the facility. Inside the execution watch cell, a stark, windowless room located just 15 feet from the death chamber, Harland paced relentlessly. His bare feet slapped against the freezing concrete floor in a frantic, irregular rhythm. At 4 p.m., the heavy metal slot on his door slid open, and a guard pushed through a beige plastic tray containing his requested final meal: a medium-rare ribeye steak, buttered mashed potatoes, and a slice of cherry pie. Harland stopped pacing and stared at the food. The smell of the roasted meat hit his stomach like a physical blow. He lunged toward the stainless steel toilet in the corner and retched violently, his body rejecting the very concept of sustenance. He spent the next hour curled in the fetal position on his thin mattress, weeping with a pathetic, high-pitched cadence. He was waiting for a miracle that the universe had already explicitly denied him. At 4:30 p.m., the warden of Terre Haute, a stern man named Robert Davies, appeared at the reinforced glass window to deliver the final word. The United States Supreme Court had officially denied Harland's last-minute petition for a stay of execution without comment. The clock had run out. 10 miles away, a black, armored government SUV cut through the bleak Indiana landscape, its tires humming a low, mournful tune against the wet asphalt. In the back seat sat Sarah Sterling. She was dressed in a pristine, tailored black dress, her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She had aged in the 3 years since her husband, Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling, had been gunned down on that muddy highway, but her grief had hardened into something unbreakable. She wasn't traveling to Terre Haute for vengeance. She was traveling for an ending. Beside her sat General Arthur Pendleton, dressed in his immaculate Army Class A uniform. The 4 silver stars on his shoulders gleamed in the dim light of the vehicle. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the hotel. He didn't need to. He was there to fulfill a promise he had made over a flag-draped casket, to see the absolute destruction of the man who had murdered one of his finest officers. At 5:45 p.m., the witnesses began to file into the viewing rooms attached to the execution chamber. The viewing area was split into 2 distinct sections, separated by a thick brick partition. On the left side sat the media pool and state witnesses. On the right, the victim's family room. Sarah, General Pendleton, and United States Attorney Richard Kavanaugh stepped into the cramped, brightly lit space. They stood shoulder to shoulder behind a massive pane of ballistic glass, looking directly into the execution chamber. The chamber itself was horrifyingly clinical. It looked more like a sterile surgical theater than an instrument of justice. In the dead center of the room sat a heavy green gurney, flanked by heart monitors and intravenous stands. At exactly 6 p.m., the heavy steel door on the far side of the chamber groaned open. Harland was escorted into the room by 3 heavily armored Bureau of Prisons tactical guards. He was wearing an olive-drab jumpsuit, his pale hands securely shackled to a thick leather belly chain. His legs simply refused to support his weight. The terror had paralyzed his central nervous system, forcing the guards to virtually drag him across the linoleum floor. His face was entirely devoid of color, his eyes wide and unblinking, locked in a state of primal, consuming panic. It was a dark, poetic twist of hard karma. The man who had thrived on inflicting terror in the dead of night was now drowning in it under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights. The guards lifted him onto the green gurney. The heavy leather straps were pulled tight, ratcheted down across his ankles, his knees, his waist, his chest, and finally his arms, pinning him completely flat. The IV team, clad in anonymous blue scrubs and surgical masks, moved in with silent, practiced efficiency. They located the veins in Harlan's left and right arms, inserted the needles, and taped the clear plastic tubes securely to his pale skin. Warden Davies stepped forward, pulling a small microphone down from the ceiling. "Inmate Harland," the warden's voice echoed through the speaker system into the witness rooms. "Do you have any last words?" Harland's head jerked to the side. Through the thick ballistic glass, his terrified, weeping eyes locked onto the victim's viewing room. He saw General Pendleton's unyielding, steely gaze. And then he saw Sarah. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She just looked at him with an absolute, chilling emptiness, as if he were already a ghost. Harlan's chest heaved against the thick leather restraints. His lips trembled violently. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to force out an apology, a plea, anything to make himself feel human in his final seconds. But the crushing weight of his guilt and terror strangled the words deep in his throat. All that escaped was a wet, pathetic, choked sob. He closed his eyes, fresh tears streaming down his cheeks, and slowly shook his head against the gurney pad. "The execution will proceed," Warden Davies announced. In the hidden adjoining room, the executioner pressed the automated plunger. A massive, lethal dose of pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate designed to shut down the central nervous system, began flowing through the clear plastic tubing and into Harlan's bloodstream. Harland took 2 deep, shuddering, ragged breaths. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. As the heavy chemical wave hit his brain, his fingers twitched against the restraints. Then his eyes rolled back, his jaw went entirely slack, and his body melted heavily into the gurney. The frantic, terrified rising and falling of his chest ceased completely. Sarah Sterling didn't blink. She didn't look away. She watched the green line on the digital heart monitor flutter briefly before dropping into a long, sustained, unbroken flat line. The high-pitched tone of the machine signaled the end. The attending physician stepped into the chamber, placed a stethoscope over Harlan's chest, shined a penlight into his unresponsive pupils, and nodded grimly to the warden. "Time of death," Warden Davies spoke into the microphone, "is 6:14 p.m. In the viewing room, the silence was absolute. General Pendleton turned slowly toward Sarah. He brought his right hand up to the brim of his cover, rendering a crisp, razor-sharp, agonizingly slow military salute. Sarah nodded back, finally allowing a single, silent tear to slip down her cheek. It wasn't shed for the pathetic man who had just died on the table, but for the brilliant, loving, honorable husband who never should have been taken from her. 2 days later, the bitter grey clouds finally broke, giving way to a brilliant, crystal-clear blue sky over Arlington National Cemetery. A lone bugler stood on a grassy hill, playing taps. The haunting, beautiful, solitary melody drifted gracefully over the endless, immaculate rows of white marble headstones. A military honor guard, moving in perfect, solemn synchronization, lifted the American flag from the casket. They folded it precisely, tucking the red and white stripes away until only the blue field of stars remained, forming a crisp, perfect triangle. General Pendleton knelt on the manicured grass, presenting the folded flag to Sarah Sterling, placing it gently and firmly into her waiting hands. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation," Pendleton said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your husband's honorable and faithful service." The sharp cracks of a 21-gun salute shattered the quiet morning air, echoing across the Potomac River. David Sterling was gone, resting among the nation's greatest heroes, but his legacy was forever cemented into the very bedrock of American law. In the direct aftermath of the explosive trial, a furious and unified Congress passed the Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling Accountability Act. It was a sweeping, monumental piece of federal legislation that ruthlessly stripped qualified immunity from any law enforcement officer found guilty of tampering with body camera footage, falsifying official reports, or planting evidence. It ensured that the blue wall of silence could never again shield a murderer from the blinding light of justice. The racist, corrupt cop who genuinely believed his badge made him an untouchable god had been thoroughly erased from the earth, executed and forgotten. But Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling's name would live forever, a permanent, unbreakable shield protecting the innocent from the dark, prejudiced corners of corruption. Hard karma had not only balanced the scales, it had forged a new dawn. What a massive, unforgettable journey. From a dark, rainy highway in North Carolina to the ultimate, chilling justice inside a federal execution chamber, this story proves that absolute corruption will eventually meet its match. Officer Harland thought his badge made him a god, but he learned the hard way that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law, especially when they cross paths with the United States military. The creation of the David Sterling Act stands as a powerful reminder that out of tragic darkness, real change can emerge to protect us all. If you were captivated by this incredible true crime saga of federal vengeance and hard karma, please smash that like button and share this video to keep Colonel Sterling's memory alive. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into the most intense stories of justice served.